Sometimes it's useful to stay with this ambiguity a little bit and think through this, because I find this is a problem, as in diversity, particularly excessive diversity, together with scale. This is a fairly explosive combination. And the way to deal with it is non-trivial for me, because on the one hand, you would like to have that catering so that the diversity does not generate a lot of inequality or consumer surplus. But then you generate all these issues of people living different lifestyles and people having completely different polarized worlds, which generates a lot of issues because we all gotta live together. So we need to figure out a way to have a common ground, right? If you try to force people to have a common ground, the kinds of people that pay for a higher proportion of the cost of having that common ground tend to be the more different kind of people. These are the kinds of people that probably are already stacking up a lot of other disadvantages just because they are different than most people. Usually in page one of Google, I find a solution that is good enough for me. And that is in part why I am a sort of satisficer. But Carol goes to page 4 or 5 and she doesn't find, right? It's just as simple as that. She doesn't find. And then it's easy for me to call her an optimizer, or perhaps it might be a more accurate perspective to just say that she's just very niche. She's just very different than most people. And
Hmm.
it's more costly for her to go after page 5 and page 6 to find a particular better fit for her. But then an integration in this scenario will be, let's just have page 1, right? And a person like me would be okay with it. I say, yeah, sure, let's just have
Yeah,
page 1. And for her, she would say, oh no, but now I cannot even go and endure going to page 5 and 6 if I think it's valuable enough. I've been thinking recently about this thing that you and I have been thinking for, 10 years now, which is this kind of tension between diversity and scale. This is related to the tyranny of the market idea that we are fairly familiar in economics, but this idea
yeah.
that for you to build something like a solution or even a word for that matter, even a concept for that matter, you need to have a critical mass of people that demand that thing. Otherwise, those things don't show up. Otherwise, it's not profitable for even people to try to build that. The concern with that is that if you think to the extent that there's a lot of diversity in terms of the kinds of things that people demand, there are people in the lower tail and the upper tail of that just they do not have enough a critical mass of people like them. And because of that, they do not get a product that is well fitted for their preferences or constraints for that matter. And because of that, you see that they have to endure getting the products that were fitted for most people. And of course, there's a major reduction of consumer surplus in that perspective,
Yeah.
and that generates inequality. So the reason I am recently thinking quite a bit about that is that I find that a lot of institutions out there, education is an obvious one, like we discussed before when we are trying to think about the need for us to perhaps observe things that are objective, that are measurable. There's a need for some form of objectivity, and that kind of objectivity may generate further inequality in ways that are unmeasurable. Just because, some people are not very good at test taking, even though they may do really well in the future. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I think that there's this tension, and we've talked about this a lot, this tension between diversity and sort of customization or individualization, right? There's that fundamental tension there. And to me, the tyranny of the market, it's kind of a break or a damper on customization, right? You can't have highly individualized products because there's some kind of scale, minimum efficient scale or something like that. And I would think of that as generating a lot of diversity in the sense that I think of sorting as being the enemy of diversity, right? And that's kind of where we converge to. And it's almost like one of the nice things about markets. Like, I don't know if this is actually correct. So let me start with that. But like the idea of a market, like a ancient Roman marketplace or ancient Greek agora or something like that, everybody's coming to one place. And then through the magic of the invisible hand, we wind up with prices, right? And And these prices are sort of like mutually reinforcing, and they have nice informational properties and efficiency properties and this and that. But it's something that's emerging socially, in contrast to more of a model of exchange where it's just two people coming together and negotiating terms of trade for something, right? And I think of the sort of the tyranny of the market as being, you can only have that market if you do have some tyranny there. If you are forcing people to kind of coalesce together, and sort of the technology has basically reduced a lot of fixed costs to things. And so that's led to the breakdown of markets and into these kinds of more exchange type situations. It's good in some cases, like you're talking about, you get this customization, which can be very good, but I think you're missing out on sort of these market level spillovers, but I'm not sure.
So just to clarify, the reason you are talking about that diversity and sorting are the enemies of each other is that the moment there are more offerings of variety and we tend to sort as a function of that, we ended up falling into a place where most of the people that made the same choice as you tend to be more similar to you, right?
Exactly.
I think it's useful to classify those kinds of choices into two different things, right? One of the things would be choices that you and I would agree that probably are not very consequential. Like, for instance, you and I choose different kinds of sodas we drink or different kinds of toothpastes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in that case, thinking about that kind of category, I think it probably matters more the consumer surplus discussion we were discussing before, right? This idea that if you offer only one kind of soda, some people got lucky that they happen to fall into close to the median preference, and then
Mm-hmm.
you get a soda that is very close to what you like, and you have a high consumer surplus because of that. Or some people get unlucky to be different enough that they do not care about that kind of soda, and they are forced either to not drink a soda and therefore get perhaps a lower consumer surplus because of that, or drink the soda that is available in the market and indeed get a lower consumer surplus relative to that person that got lucky to have a closer preference to the median.
Can I just say one thing real quick? That this
Yeah.
is because we've talked about this idea before, and my thinking on this has changed a little bit. And I just want to say
Tell me.
this one thing, that we used to talk about like sorting to toothpastes or sodas as, okay, these are inconsequential type of choices, whereas schools and political parties are important ones, right? And
Yeah.
I am starting to reconsider whether these are inconsequential,
Good.
because when you meet some stranger and it's like, oh, you like Coke more than Pepsi? I like Coke more than Pepsi. It kindles a bond. And I think this is primal or something. There's the idea of like the narcissism of small differences, where when you and I are talking and we might have very similar views about something, we very quickly hone in on our point of disagreement and blow that up. But I think there's sort of the inverse of that, which is that when you're interacting with somebody that's very, very different from you, you latch on to tiny little similarities, and those tiny little similarities have become extremely important links. And and so I'm maybe these are small individually and they aggregate up to something big, which would matter. But now I'm starting to think maybe they're actually even big individually, but just in different contexts, right? So if I'm in a context, if I'm going to a room with a whole bunch of people that I don't know, I like, yeah, I'm meeting a whole bunch of people I don't know. I'm going to scan around and I'm going to try to like quickly laser in on some form of similarity. Like, oh, you're wearing those socks. I heard about those socks. Something very trivial like that. But that is kind of the catalyst for forming the bond. So I have kind of started to worry about the trivial stuff too.
This is an interesting point. So I also wonder to what extent this is actually rational, right? As in a world with imperfect information, I think it may be rational because to the extent that preferences are correlated, you might expect that the kinds of people that tend to like Coke, they also tend to have more similarities on other things. So you could predict based on whether you are drinking Coke or whether you are wearing the same shoes as I am, whether
Yeah.
maybe your perspective on several other things tend to be more similar to me
Mm.
than to the random person. And a, let's say, Bayesian person, considering that, might decide to lean towards joining a conversation with you instead of with this random other person, right? Because they have a little bit more information about you. So,
Yeah. But it might also be like sometimes I happen to be wearing a yellow shirt. I see somebody else wearing a yellow shirt. We're like, hey, we're both wearing yellow shirts. And now I think we are like qualitatively closer than we would have been if we didn't wear that yellow shirt. And I mean, I suppose it could be a signal of, oh, people with yellow shirts tend to be more optimistic and open minded. I don't know. Maybe there's something there. And
I do agree that it doesn't need to be rational, right? It could be just an
yeah,
evolutionary byproduct of our ancestors having lived hundreds of thousands of years
yeah,
in
exactly.
small bands of tribes, right?
Yeah.
So of course I get that. So going back to this idea, in that case that you're saying, maybe a better categorization of the problem would be some choices that are not consequential. And by now, let me rephrase what I meant by not consequential. It's not necessarily not consequential, as in it's not something that generates a lot of potential typical consequences like a school or a blog or the TV news channel or things like that, but also
Mhm.
consequential in terms of it's not salient in people's information set so that they then decide to sort close to each other or
Yeah.
far away from each other, right?
Yeah.
And then there are other things like toothbrushes and toothpaste. Like you don't know
Yeah.
that, like you and I are friends for what,
Yeah. We
20
don't
years
talk
now,
about
and you and I don't know the toothbrush you use and the toothbrush I use,
that.
right? So it's not salient information. So there are
Yeah.
other things like that. So I guess the only extent to which we care about those choices, those inconsequential choices, is really related to this consumer surplus problem. And of course, in that case, to allow for people to explore their diversity is a really good thing. And whenever you have problems of scale that essentially imposes restrictions about how much variety shows up in the market, I think we would tend to feel like, okay, this is a bad thing. This is bad news, right? You see what I mean? Because, if you are a very niche kind of person, if you are like literally a minority, right? You will have to get a product that is not quite designed for you and you will have a lower consumer surplus. So that is the first issue. But then there is this other side of things, which is sometimes scale forces certain products that are just more restricted in terms of variety, which would lead to less intense sorting, which will, by definition, lead to more integration. Now, that integration could be helpful because of these consequential issues that we talked about, right? If you have a particular school that everybody goes to the same school, in principle, everybody could be tapping the same resources, right? But as you and I very well know, this is not a reality, right? Like, for instance, the choices happen at several different levels, including levels that go downstream from the choice of the school. Like, for instance, if you and I go to the same school and I'm poor and you're rich, it looks like you and I are tapping into the same resources, but maybe it's possible that my kid goes to a regular class in that school and your kid goes to some kind of advanced math class and you have a better teacher, or you are more likely to knock at the door of the principal and complain when something doesn't work. I'm less likely to complain. And that could be what we usually call opportunity hoarding, where now you go to a school that has a lot of rich people and poor people, but then rich people, because they usually have more time or more bandwidth to complain to the principal, they tend to hoard resources towards engineering and robotics and less resources towards like extended childcare and other things that perhaps would be disproportionately preferred by poorer people. So I
Mhm.
was wondering, how should we even think about this issue here, right? Because the issue of scale is happening at all those levels. And these are extremely consequential issues because the moment you generate certain products but not others, two things happen, right? On the one hand, you have more integration, which I can see the positive side of that, but we do have the consumer surplus problem, right? Like, for instance, if you have a school where most people are white and then there are some people there that are Hispanics,
Mhm.
just by the sheer decision of the principal to maximize the targeting of those amenities towards the majority, the amenities are going to be far away from those minorities, in this case, the Hispanic people. And maybe
Hmm.
there would not be the availability to say of English as a second language class, which that Hispanic kid would love to have, or something like that, right? And then that kid will have, of course, to endure the fact that they are in a school where things are not quite catered to them. On the other hand, you also have the positive side that that kid is now more integrated, perhaps. So the reason I say this is because I think there is heterogeneity in the price people take to generate this benefit for other people. Like, for instance,
Yeah.
that Hispanic kid may pay a higher price in terms of how much willingness to pay they reduced for that integration.
Yeah.
And the white kids, because they are the majority, they pay a lower price for that integration. And
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
always worried about that because, and I think this is, I do believe that this is very related to why a lot of people who are right now providing a lot of pressure towards further integration, they are not actually necessarily minorities, you know? They are usually
Yeah.
majorities who are saying that. And part of the reason they are saying that, I think, I believe that, is that they are paying lower price for that integration because
Yeah.
they will, in equilibrium, show up in a school that has barely changed versus counterfactually if they were segregated. So they do not exert much of the cost of that integration when the Hispanic kid who counterfactually could be in a fully Hispanic school that would have their amenity catered to them. Now they would have to counterfactually be in an integrated school, which will have amenities that are far away. They're very different. They're not catered
Yeah.
to people like them.
I think that if you kind of peel one layer back, what may have happened is I think people's preferences for integration have changed substantially. And in 40 years ago, I think there was greater demand by minorities for integration. And maybe there was this greater demand because of downstream discrimination in labor markets or something else. So it could be this demand was there for bad reasons, quote unquote bad reasons downstream, but nevertheless there was greater demand for integration. And so yes, even though these people are paying a greater price on net, they might be it kind of mitigates this sort of difference. And I think what has happened now is is preferences have changed due to, I mean, I think these are society wide, culture wide shifts, and preferences have shifted away from minorities demanding assimilation and integration. And that's what makes this problem starker. Now, again, I don't know if this is purely coming as a result of there being less discrimination in the labor market or something, then maybe that's a great price to pay. I'm not so sure it's just because of that. Ultimately, it becomes almost like a preference engineering problem as opposed to an allocation problem, taking preferences as given.
Yeah, but let's go deeper into this because I think I'm a little bit more zoom in, you're more zoom out. So I agree with everything you said. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I believe very much this idea of what doesn't kill you make you stronger. And I think there has been an increase in demand for comfort. And I think this
Mm-hmm.
has generated a lot of issues related to that. People are
Yeah.
less willing to expose themselves to diversity. And that has been a problem. Of course, certain dimensions along which you get exposed to are more okay now, and others are less okay. People,
Yeah.
I guess, people are less okay. That's my perspective, at least, get exposed to diversity in terms of political views. And I think people are more okay, perhaps, getting exposed to diversity related to race. Uh, I think there has been some backlash recently about people perhaps getting less okay being exposed to diversity in terms of gender, true. So I think there are some changes about that. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do understand where you're coming from. So I think there is a positive externality that involves being more okay, getting exposed to this difference. And we need to talk about. I am totally okay with that. But I also
Mm-hmm.
think, and this is the degree of resolution that I was at, I also think that there is an asymmetry about who pays the price for doing that exposure to diversity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is why it gets me a little skeptical when I hear in the news or when I hear in some pundits or even some people like you and I, right, saying we need to expose people to diversity. I'm a little skeptical about that because usually the kinds of people that are more likely to have voice to say those things, they are exactly literally the majority as in number of people in terms of critical mass. It is more likely that integration should be sort of under the radar for them because it's very similar to what they already have in a polarized world because there's no need for the integration to generate much of a change of amenities for them because they are very similar to the majority of people. Like, for instance, it's similar
Yeah.
to what you and I discussed last time, right? As in, when I was talking about the case that me versus Carol, like, for instance, if I need help with some self-development help or something for my self-growth, I usually in page one of Google, I find a solution that is good enough for me. And that is in part why I am a sort of satisficer. But Carol goes to page 4 or 5 and she doesn't find, right? It's just as simple as that. She doesn't find. And then it's easy for me to call her an optimizer, or perhaps it might be a more accurate perspective to just say that she's just very niche. She's just very different than most people. And
Hmm.
it's more costly for her to go after page 5 and page 6 to find a particular better fit for her. But then an integration in this scenario will be, let's just have page one, right? And a person like me would be okay with it. I say, yeah, sure, let's just
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
page one. And for her, she would say, oh no, but now I cannot even go and endure going to page 5 and 6 if I think it's valuable enough. So she ends up paying much more of the cost for the integration. So I worry about that. Whenever I find paradox like that, I find it really hard to not try to go fast into, oh no, my opinion is this, to
Yeah.
find a solution. But of course, sometimes it's useful to stay with this ambiguity a little bit and think through this, because I find this is a problem, as in diversity, particularly excessive diversity. There are many issues in the world that have excessive diversity together with scale. This is a fairly explosive combination. And the way to deal with it is non-trivial for me because on the one hand, you would like to have that catering point that we talked before so that the diversity does not generate a lot of inequality or consumer surplus. But then you generate all these issues of people living different lifestyles and people having completely different polarized worlds, which generates a lot of issues because we all live together, so we need to figure out a way to have a common ground, right? But then on the other hand, you have this issue that if you try to force people to have a common ground, the kinds of people that pay for a higher proportion of the cost of having their common ground tend to be the more different kind of people, which of course there's some correlation that these are the kinds of people that probably are already stacking up a lot of other disadvantages just because they are different than most people. Some of them are advantages, like if you are very different, chances are your ideas might be less redundant and that could be valuable. You could be more innovative. But most of them could be things like you just, you know, one thing that I noticed myself, for instance, is that even when I try to edit these kinds of videos here, right? When I try to do minor edits on these videos, I barely need to edit you because the automatic edit that the app helps me, it just does very nicely for you. And it does very bad for me because I have accent and you don't. You see, I spend a disproportionate amount of my time working on edits for my voice. And if you were speaking alone, you would not. And that doesn't show up in the world. And that is a major disadvantage, for instance, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's true. But I guess I mean, just the polar case would be the hyper customized world, right? Where you're getting exactly what you want versus the one size fits all Soviet Union or something like that. And I think that I think that it's yes, it's a matter of degree, but the fact that some groups do have to bear more of the cost of this or others, I don't see how that it's not obvious to me what a policy would be to kind of address that. And I don't even know what I would call that. Yeah, like I'm trying to think of what kind of system of transfers would would
Exactly.
would solve that
Yeah,
or implement it. But I guess it kind of maybe this is the full circle. It kind of goes back to in a world where everybody was satisficers, you would need fewer transfers, right? You just need to get people to
I
get to
agree.
that thing. And so the broader point might be how do we change our mindsets? This is why I was kind of describing it before as like a preference engineering kind of problem. I, I think that a lot of these issues of sort of social welfare or whatever, there it's about changing our preferences or changing our preferences basically, which is something that economists have been very loath to think about or as actual policies. But I think shifts in preferences are the actual drivers of like we study a lot technology as economists, right? And that's is these shifts in production functions, right? And we never study shifts in utility functions. And it's these are the two kind of flip sides, right? And why do we not do that? Like it it seems really asymmetric to me. We would have no trouble talking about what if you changed input costs or something like that. And we have so much trouble talking about what if you changed preference parameters. And it's not that there's good reasons for that. Like, what does it mean to change a preference parameter? And then what does utility mean? How do we even think about these conceptually? Like, yeah, these are hard to grapple with, but in terms of what actually is realistic and what actually is a good description of the world, that's what matters, right?
So, yeah, I definitely am open to discuss this because I think this is very underappreciated. I think, for instance, related to how does one change preference, a lot of it has to do with social norms, as we were talking last time, right?
Yeah.
Because social norms create prescriptions, right? It creates expectations about how one should behave, and it creates some form of penalty for people to behave in a certain way versus not in a certain way. Of course, social norms can be effective at that. I think it's worth perhaps discussing the idea about is there, for instance, scope for us creating some form of compensation that is asymmetric for such integration to happen, where perhaps minorities will be compensated further for them to be integrated than majorities would, right? Because after all, they do pay a higher price
Well,
for
here's a
that.
simple example. What if there was a norm? What if we had a norm of acting like the median person, a norm of representativeness or something like that, right? If this and so basically you get this, there's an added payoff that scales in your distance to the median, whatever. Now, if you're somebody that's way outside there, you have to take more effort, certainly, to act more like the median person. But if this norm is very strong, you also get a much bigger payoff for that, right? And so there could be, if the costs are convex and the payoff is concave, it could be the case that you are going to, if you're far away from there, you're going to make more moves than the person that's really close in, right? So I think that these things are absolutely what's going on. Somebody trying to fit in with everybody else, yeah, they're making more efforts to do that if they're very different, but they're also getting a bigger payoff, right?
So, of course, I do not dispute the fact that if you are farther from the median, then if you have a linear compensation, like you're suggesting initially, you would expect that you're going to get more money, let's say, right, out of getting closer to the median, right? But I would argue with you, and of course, I get that my guess is that you'll be right for certain instances and I'll be right in other instances. Uh, I think self growth is a very obvious dimension. So let's say that this goes back to Carol versus me, right? Let's say that I want to improve on something.
Mm-hmm.
When I read the books that are written about things, clearly they help me because when I read books, clearly there are enough people that have similar experiences than me that I can easily get a lot of good tips from those books. Perhaps a person like Carol, or even let's exaggerate, a person that is really even more of an outlier than Carol, that person is not only different than the median, like you said, but also the marginal cost for that person to do any marginal deviation closer to the median is actually higher, just because they have no resource to do that. Because they're so different, they have no books out there for them, no resources, no other person that have similar experience for them to give good tips and things like that. So I'm worried about that because I also see a lot of people going into things like Eastern medicine and like things that perhaps a person like me for many years, up until 2 years ago, I would label these people as, let's say, gullible and people that do not believe in science and things like that. I do believe, of course, there's a subset of these people that are gullible. They have a whatever, a soft understanding of what reality is and things like that. But I think a lot of these people could be doing those things just because they are not getting a solution from what you and I might call more an objective solution, which is something more like that is showing up in science. And they need
Hmm.
to look around and they need to go to the metaphorical page 5 of Google, right? And once they do that, they will go into weird kinds of solutions for chronic pain and weird kinds of solutions for their stomach or their gut health or something like that. And then some of that might work for them, some of them might not work for them, or some of them, they might even try to navigate this complex situation with a lot of their intuition because they don't have a better compass like you and I might have with actual other people have been distilling some of the insights already because they have written books about it. I find that there's
Hmm.
a lot of this inequality in lifestyle that can be explained purely based on this issue, namely the
But
fact that
why do
people
you
are
use the
very
word
different and the
inequality?
marginal cost is different. Huh?
Why do you use the word inequality? That's the part that
Well,
I don't
by
get.
inequality, you don't think there's inequality between, in this example, Karen and I, in terms of
Well,
our consumer surplus? Like, for instance, let's define my utility versus her utility. And let's
yeah.
say some of them will be proportional to the time I spent on solving a problem, because then I will
Hmm.
have a more flexibility. If I spend less time solving a given problem of mine, I have
Hmm.
24 hours minus the amount I spent on
Yeah.
to do everything else I want to do, including sleeping and having fun and working, all those things. And then you have
Hmm.
another person that spends 24 hours minus a lot more time solving their same problem. If you fix whether Karen and I have solved our problems, both of us fix our problems. She spent substantially more time solving the same problem as I did. So she has less residual time to do whatever else she needs to do in her life. So I'll call that
Okay.
inequality, right?
Okay. Then, but I guess then, what is the first best then?
So I think the first pass will be some form of definition. First, we need to define what property rights are. What are the property rights? As in, almost like in a Coase theorem situation, right? Later we figure out whether there are transaction costs, and then later we figure out whether there are trades to be made. So if we believe that we have the property rights of everything that we have in ourselves, our skills, our abilities, but also all our constraints. Our constraints are our responsibility.
Mhm.
Then I would not say we should do anything necessarily, because the fact that I got lucky to be born sort of similar to the median, I own the property rights of all that. So tough luck for those people that did not uh,
Yeah.
get born lucky on that. Okay. Now, just to be clear, I do not think this is a coherent way of seeing the world, because we can reason me out of that. But when I introspect about this, I think that the only intellectually honest way that I myself can go into this is to understand things more in the lines of Rawls' theory of justice, some form of veil of ignorance, right? Something like, it is not my doing that I have certain positive realizations of the random variable, like I do not choose to not have a disease, say, in my brain that gives me all these capabilities. And some people, of course, do not choose to have it.
But why does
And
that
then,
mean it's not the like because you have different endowments and you start with property rights over those endowments, right?
no,
Uh,
no, but I'm actually trying to talk about an alternative approach, right? So
okay.
if you are in the axiom that it is my property rights of those endowments, then yes, then we're done, right? But
Yeah.
I really do not think and I think honestly, it will be useful for us to talk about that perhaps another time, right? Because I don't think it's sustainable for us as society to live under what I would call an illusion that we have this property right. Or I would not call that an illusion. I don't think it's a good axiom for us all in society to live in where we have this property right, because I don't think this is sustainable. The reason being that I think the moment we are able to step back and understand that some people got lucky in some dimensions and got unlucky in other dimensions, and other people tend to be more stacked against them because they got unlucky systematically in more dimensions than I did and things like that. The moment we start stepping back in situations like that, you start realizing that perhaps there is a common ground out there, but we cannot see this common ground because we are putting too much attention in our own realization. So let me make my point more clear with an example, I think. So
Hmm.
I think if I make a statement like, okay, everybody should worry about global warming, or everybody should worry about the control problem or the alignment problem in AI and things like that, right?
Hmm.
These are things that if I say this, of course, you would agree with me that this is a major concern. But I think there's a little bit of a privilege going on in the way I'm me saying this statement, right? Because there are some people out there that would never, right now, would never vote in favor of a politician whose main platform would be global warming. And some of them, of course, might not vote because they disagree with that. But some of these people would have agreed if they were in the same level of the pyramid of needs as we are, right?
Hmm.
They just happen to not be, right? Like, for instance, some people just need medicine for their kid or need food for their family or live paycheck to paycheck, or there's many reasons why you might not even be thinking in the future like that, right? And of
Yeah.
course, it's a luxury for people like you and I to not be thinking about those things so much, which allows us to have more free time to think about the things that we are thinking right now. We're even trying to discuss problems that are fairly abstract because it's not like it's going to show up in our lives tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
So I am concerned about that because I think there's an illusion of difference of opinions. And perhaps if we step back and acknowledge the fact that there are some people really that got unlucky and got stacked up against them and so on, and we were able to
Hmm.
solve that kind of problem, forming almost like an insurance system related to the veil of ignorance, right? To the fact that you ex ante doesn't know you're going to be born from a
Hmm.
highly educated family, or you'll be born from a poor family, or you're going to be born with a disease or without a disease. We could have, in principle, that's what I'm suggesting. We could have perhaps an insurance system. And I think a positive benefit we could get all of that is that we would not have to be exposed to this kind of what I would call fake heterogeneity, this fake diversity of opinions, which I think it's probably is masking a lot of similar opinions. So, for instance, when I get a person that comes from a highly educated family and I talk to people about global warming, most of them sort of agree with me, not necessarily fully agree with me, but there's more common ground. And I
Hmm.
bet that if you get, this is not only about global warming, but other topics, you get more similarities. And I think it has a lot to do with this illusion that we all have that we are different. And I think it speaks to this point that I was saying before, that oftentimes the solution to diversity is not homogeneous institutions, is rather the opposite, like an institution that can mitigate the negative sides of diversity, but can at the same time exploit positively the positive side of diversity. And of course, we can talk about that because I think you did mention one example. I think the market system has some very good advantage of that. And we could talk about that. Of course, it has disadvantages, as you and I know, but maybe it's a potential way of going after that.
So yeah, so I agree with all of what you're saying here. I don't see what the alternative is. Like, yes, there are these issues with treating what you have as your endowment as you have property rights over this, and now let's play it on past that. But what is this insurance scheme that you're thinking about, or what do you have in mind as an alternative to this?
Okay, so let's not talk about the bigger insurance scheme, which would perhaps involve some form of universal basic income, maybe tax by some form of AI value added. Let's not talk about this right now because
No, but
let's just pick a
I think,
yeah,
I think all of those, the endowment that I'm talking about is it's
yeah.
not just the it's not just the it's not just the levels of the goods, let's say. It's the utility function itself. And there's no policy in my mind that generates
So
that works on that lever. Like the
I think
real
it's
level of
fair.
heterogeneity is the utility function itself.
No, no, no. I think it's fair, and there's something to talk about what you're saying. But let me just add one additional thing that is worth mentioning here, which is when we look at people making different choices, as you know,
Hmm.
the reason could be because they have different preferences,
Hmm.
but they could also have different constraints, right?
Sure.
And so it's worth it to mention that when we see different people making different choices, constraints could be the issue. And I do take your point that I think in economics, we do talk quite a bit about heterogeneity of constraints. And that's why choices happen in different ways, because that's
Yeah.
usually manipulable, right? Usually
Yeah.
an instrument for policy.
Prices.
And
Yeah.
the point that you are making is that perhaps in economics, we think very little about instruments of policy that involve changing preferences, right? And in fact, part of the reason why it's so hard to think about those things is exactly because I would argue, right? It is much harder for us to think about heterogeneous stuff. And I think, for instance, it's much more likely to believe that there are enough people that share similar constraints that I do. Because, I may have similar preferences
Yeah.
about one thing as you do, but I can value other things very different. And that would mean you and I essentially have different preferences. So I think that is very relevant. So I would also argue that a way perhaps that we can think in terms of manipulating preferences would be it's almost like through constraints, like through social norms, right? Because social norms will create some form of additional constraints about you behaving a certain way. And I don't know if you would like to call that preference or you would like to call that constraint.
I think that these kinds of things that reduce inequality in the way you're talking about it, they have to be norms that basically buffer people's payoffs towards a single point, right? But these are going to be norms of liking the same thing. These are going to be norms of homogeneity. These are not going to be norms of
No,
diversity,
no, no.
right?
I agree. I think there's when you look like when you narrow down your vision and you pay attention specifically about the case that you're talking about, there is a little bit of a of a trade-off between efficiency and inequality there. Let me argue,
Sure.
right? The efficiency part is the one you said, right? The idea that you need something homogeneous, otherwise, I mean, there are lots of costs involved with that, right?
No, no,
So
it's not about implementation costs. It's about, let's say you could, it's about people getting. So, for example, let's say Carol needs to go to 5 pages of the internet to figure stuff out, and you only need to go to one, right? If instead we said that, hey, you get this payoff from using the first choice, right? And let's say this payoff is very, very, very high. We establish this socially that payoff is very, very, very high. Then it might not solve that problem, but it might give Carol so much utility that going to the first page or the fifth page is immaterial at that point, right? And so that
Sure,
will
but
now
the
she's
concern
going to
though,
end up doing the same thing as you, and she's going to be very, very, very similar to you in terms of well-being.
no, I take that point. I understand that if we were able to manipulate that without any cost at individual level, I think we will be living in a much better world. So that's what I meant in terms of efficiency. But I think what effectively is happening here is that we, let's say the majority, are imposing disproportionately on the minority to do this change. And I'm always skeptical about coming up with rules and suggestions of change when I'm not the one doing the change. Because naturally, I mean, the world revolves around, it's not fully, but it revolves around the median. People that have power revolves around the median, in part
Yeah.
because they also have more free time to do the things because they do not need to spend their time dealing with the fact that they are away from the median. So I'm concerned about the fact that if we are the ones that have more voice about this, we would eventually impose changes and integration, and not physical integration, but exact integration with respect to these kinds of things that
Mhm.
would generate more cost for people that are kind of under the radar. So one potential issue is that I think if we acknowledge the fact that we want to go there, and yet perhaps we will be okay compensating these people, and we can talk about what compensation means here, but we could figure out a way of compensating these people for them going there. So let me give you an example that has nothing to do with what we're discussing, and I think this will be
Yeah.
a kind of a better analogy, okay? So look, for instance, Brazil and the Amazon rainforest, right?
Mhm.
Currently, from the perspective of, I think everybody in the world sort of agree that Brazil has essentially the property right over its territory.
Mhm.
And maybe a president of France or somebody else comes along and start putting pressure on Brazilian government because they are exploiting the environment in the Amazon rainforest.
Mhm.
And I think I understand the perspective of the French president in doing so, but
Mhm.
then somebody in Brazil may come along and make the statement, hey, we have a lot of those specific kinds of resources and we are exploiting them because that's all we have.
Mhm.
You may have other kinds of resources that you are also exploiting. So if you want me to not exploit my resources, pay me up. Just, I don't
Yeah.
want you to speak only. Just speak with your money, not only with your mouth. Pay me up to compensate for me not to do that, and I would not do that. Or
Okay.
perhaps, a separate argument that I hear from Brazilians there would be countries that have developed a lot in the past decades created a lot of pollution when nobody was paying attention about pollution, like China and the United States, actually. But now
Mhm.
that everybody's paying attention about pollution, we have not yet developed. And oftentimes,
Yeah.
the way to develop would be to generate a lot of pollution. So you have enjoyed that. Now, either let me enjoy that or let me not enjoy that, but pay me up, right? For me not
Yeah.
to enjoy that. So I find that those ideas coming from the Brazilians are also fair. The same way as I think that what the French
Yeah.
people are also saying. Because, like, for instance, the French people could also say something like, well, I'm okay with whatever you're saying, but also I do have the power to keep saying whatever I want to say and putting pressure on you and creating difficulties for you to keep doing whatever you're doing. And I have the legitimacy to do that. So I think the French government could say the same about that, right? I get that. I think it's an anarchist system, the world, right? So I understand that everybody could be doing what is best for them. But I also find that uh, I do think that some ideas are coherent and others are not. And by coherent here, I don't mean coherent in general. I mean what I would call intellectually honest. I do not think if you get two people in a room currently, right? You can change my mind about this, but if you get two people in a room, and I think you can reason two people into the idea that for all intents and purposes, I just landed where I am, as in there's nothing that I currently enjoy that is actually my doing. You might be
Yeah.
thinking superficially that is some of my doing, but I would argue you can keep going, you can zoom in and keep talking, reason with the other person, you'll find out that there's nothing really that is my doing. And if that is the case, perhaps the only way forward perhaps could be a situation where we acknowledge that and we move on from there by creating some form of asymmetric compensations for people who are different from each other. So let me tell you something, because I would like to criticize my point that I just said. Okay. So here's why I think it's a paradox, because the thing I don't like about what I just said is essentially what you were saying earlier, right? Which is I am concerned about almost like the moral hazard problem, right? Which is now you get people to be more okay with their differences, and they are not internalizing the fact that it is costly for society for you to be too different. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And because of the issues of efficiencies that we talked before. So that is the current where I am in terms of this paradox, right? On the one hand, I understand the inequality that gets generated, and I even would argue that I'm leaning towards creating more fairness about this. But then you could create this kind of second level incentive scheme where people will be more okay. It will be the opposite that I want, right? I really believe in this: what doesn't kill you make you stronger, this idea of increasing your
Mm-hmm.
tolerance to differences. But then the moment we increase our tolerance to difference, it's almost like the price of not being different changes, you see?
So let me give you an alternative solution to this problem, a very radically alternative solution to the problem. So you get your two people in the room together, and you get them to agree that they their different station in life is not their doing, right? They were born with different endowments, and you get them to fully internalize this idea, right? And now, instead of coming up with a way to do this, if you can convince these people that, okay, the only source of your well-being is not your endowment, but rather things you do. So you give people some notion of value added, that, hey, your objective is actually value added over endowment and not anything else, right? If you can do that, then the differences in endowments don't matter. Then you've solved this problem. So if you can convince people, if you can truly convince people that their objective function is to maximize value added over endowment as opposed to value, then you solve this problem.
Why would you
And
solve this problem?
because now people are going to decide to take these actions. Okay, you're not going to perfectly solve it if there's some kind of non-linearities or whatever, but now people, they're incentivized to take actions that are going to add quote unquote value to their life, right? And it doesn't
But
matter.
like I said, I think this is like a privileged situation. So what if I am disabled? Why would that person be elastic to your incentive?
Okay, so let's say let's say you and me, and I'm born and I can't walk, and you can, right? And if we both believe that our our source of well-being is doing the best that we can, then we can both get the same amount of well-being, right? And the best that I can is not going to be the best that you can under any objective measure, because there's going to be things that I can't do. I'm facing an extra constraint here that you're not. However, that doesn't matter, right? It's a matter of our objective has changed. Now, this is hard to convince people of,
No,
but
no, no.
I would argue
I think you have a fair point. Okay, so I understand now what you're saying. Okay, so I think
I would argue that
I
this has been
understand
the
your point.
goal of a
It's
lot of
complicated.
traditions to
Yeah, it is complicated, but I think I do understand what you're saying. So I think your point is utility is not a cardinal concept, and maybe to even consider some notion of inequality across people is perhaps an ill-defined concept. Let's use some kind of old concepts, right? Maybe the goal is for everybody to have some form of eudaimonia, some notion that you are
Yeah.
at your best self right there, right? And
Yeah.
I think nothing that you said is inconsistent to what I was thinking. I see a lot of that with people like us, like people like me and people like you. So I came originally from Brazil. And when I achieve a given amount of success in the United States, my guess is that I probably feel a little bit happier, all else constant, than an American who achieved the same level of success, because it feels to me like, wow, I came from really a poor country or something like that, right? Or you do the same with, perhaps because you are a second generation from India and so on, right? So maybe there's a benefit there. So in other words, there's less of a role for that need for compensation. But the point that I was trying to make that is more in favor of what you're saying is this other point, which is over and above that, I think I am concerned. It's almost like I need some form of truth telling mechanism. As in, imagine you create a law that generates this compensation. Then tomorrow, most people could say, oh, no, I'm very different. I'm very niche. And then
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of people are
Exactly.
saying that. You see, that's my concern. I would say that certain concepts are more, I would say, sustainable than others, right? The I think the idea of being okay with being different and increasing your tolerance to be different, but also being okay with other people being different and increasing your tolerance with other people being different. I think this is a very sustainable concept, right?
Yeah.
And the concept of what doesn't kill you is bad for you, the opposite, I think that is not a
Yeah. Yeah.
sustainable concept, right?
Just to kind of tie this all together, you're talking about eudaimonia and things like that. That's the whole idea behind that is that, hey, what you want to maximize is virtue, right? This is your true objective, right? And this is something that is in principle available to everybody regardless of their endowment. And this is the same that's true in pretty much every kind of ancient philosophical tradition. The thing that you actually should be maximizing is endowment independent, right? You should be maximizing goodness. You should be maximizing harmony if you're talking to Confucius. All of these things are independent of the actual draw you got from nature, right?
I do agree with
And
that.
and
This relates to
I think that what's happened right now is that, and when I say right now, over the last several hundred years, and particularly more recently, is that we're conflating objectives with measurable things, and these measurable things like extreme version prosperity gospel, like, oh, your life score, or if you're some Wall Street bro, your life score is like the number in your bank account. Like, no, that of course is going to be highly dependent on your initial endowment, right? And the key instead is to this is maybe a little woo woo and hand wavy, but we have to reorient ourselves to objectives that are endowment independent. And maybe the reason we spent so much time doing that was because inequality was so extreme, because the pharaoh had 99.999% of all the wealth in Egypt and everybody else was barely surviving. And so maybe that was the coping mechanism to deal with this. And we got these kinds of ideas. But I think there's some real kind of like durable value in these sorts of ideas that we've very much come away from recently.
I
And
agree.
it's hard for me to think about something that's going to be both intellectually consistent and immune to these sort of moral hazard type issues or clunky potential policies than something like this that's on the preference side as opposed to on the endowment or price side. You know what I mean?
So I agree with everything you said. I just don't think what you said is necessarily representative of all the potential concerns. So for instance, in fact I live my life over some stoic principles, or at least I try to live my life under some stoic principle, the idea of you try to focus on only the things that you can control, not on the things that you cannot control, which is very related to your point. You essentially, more like in an economist perspective, would be your your endowment or the cards that you are dealt with. This is some cost, right? So let's just
Yeah.
not focus on that whatsoever. Let's focus on what you can change from that, right? So I get it. I totally agree with that. the concern, and this is why I think that my perspective on this, and perhaps your perspective based on what you just said on this, is not representative. Because if you say this to a person who is suffering more versus if you say this for a person who is suffering less right now, and that
Absolutely.
relates to the current level of endowment, you will find that their mental bandwidth is going to be very different to even consider entering that scenario.
No, this is a theoretical construct.
Which is fine. I'm on the same page with you. But that is the part that I think, to what extent we, let's say the majority, when we say things like that, to be clear, I do believe that this is the sustainable idea out there. Okay. But how can we do that nudge on these other people to do it, to arrive there? This is why, again, I go back to my only coherent approach that I can think of, which is to actually give them resources, something like universal basic income, for them to take out their boot out of their neck. And the way they're going to spend their money, one person is going to be probably very different from the way another person is going to spend their money. And the same way as you and I have different preferences and different constraints, and you and I spend our money probably very differently, but the residual of that is that you and I have more similar opinions about that. We all feel it's a luxury and we can think about those things because all our main sources of differences kind of have been dealt with money, right? Because thankfully we don't need a barter system where for me to buy something, I need to be able to offer the exact same thing for the person who's giving me that something that I want. No, we can all use money to solve most of our problems that are issues that you and I are different from each other. And once we do that, we have the residualized situation, which is I'm no longer thinking about basic things about needs. And now I can talk about things and you and I can have similar opinions. I think for us to go and put more people in this bandwagon, for me, in my perspective, is that we need to figure out a way to reduce their almost like their basic needs. And I think then they will be more inclined to listen to a conversation about stoicism. I do not know data on this, but my guess is that the kinds of people that feel that pay a lot of attention in stoicism, they are people closer to the median. That would be my guess.
We historically have had lots of nudges to try to push people towards that kind of ideal that have absolutely nothing to do with transfers or policies. We had nudges, we had big cultural institutions that are inculcating in our minds that these are the things that we should be pushing for. And there's obviously downsides to that. And these institutions get corrupted and whatnot. But we used to have that. And I think in this whatever
what
technocratic moment.
What do you have in mind in institutions?
I think so. Let's say that the best version of the church tells you that, hey, these are the things that are important for your life. Get married, do this, do that, have a kid, blah, blah, blah. Right? We have these things, and these become the prescriptions for and these are the source of a great deal of meaning. And we have that. And that's entirely through the demand side. It has nothing to do with transfers or anything like that, right? We have nudges like this, and I think that we moved entirely to technocratic approaches to these problems in the last 50 years. And for the reasons that we're talking about, technocrats have levers over prices and endowments, and they don't have levers over these, or don't have good levers over these. And I think we're really starting to see the limitations of technocratic approaches. And the biggest kind of like flashing red light to me that we're seeing these real limitations is subjective well-being is stalled or decreasing. And a lot of people, it's subjective well-being is being decoupled from objective well-being, kind of like wealth and things like that. People are sad or people have less hope. So like Carol Graham has some stuff that looks at these hope related measures of subjective well-being. These are particularly in free fall, and people are less excited and it's manifesting in not having kids and things like that. This reliance on the technocratic approaches, it's at best complementary to kind of the demand side approaches that we kind of have.
But when you think about technocratic approach, you think more like a top-down approach. And when you think it about what you're calling like churches will be some form of coalitions, they are much more decentralized.
When I'm thinking of technocratic, I'm thinking of supply side versus demand side, basically. I'm thinking about changing prices or changing endowments. So changing endowments would be probably top down, but changing prices could be very much bottom up, right? But I think of that as a very technocratic approach. Let's try to operate through constraints to get people in a better place. And alternatively, you could be operating through preferences to get people in a better place or payoffs, right? So that's kind of the and I think that it's hard, it's
I don't
technocratically
think I am.
difficult to.
So let me try to understand. So the church thing, give me a concrete example of the church. Would it be changing the preference side in which way?
It would be changing the preference side in the sense that, let's say that you foster a big identity, and this kind of, if you
Yeah,
identify as a certain type of person, then you get benefits from doing things that's what somebody's supposed to do. Oh, somebody's supposed to have a family and do this and do
I
that,
agree.
and they're not
I
supposed to
understand.
do other things, get into gambling and this and that. And like, it's true that there's some people who just like genuinely love gambling and hate these other things, and they're bearing a cost there. However, in overall utility terms, they might be better off if you foster that very strong sense of identity in them. And again,
Mhm.
like, this is not a silver bullet. This is obviously, the
No,
church is highly
I get it.
corruptible,
No, I
but
agree with you saying. I agree with everything
these
you're
kinds
saying.
of
Like a
approaches
so
are have been neglected, I think,
I agree with you
recently.
saying. I guess like the nuance there that I think it was harder for me to understand is that I don't even know how to think about changing preferences or change a constraint there. So I would say that these are different ways of instilling social norms, which I would call
Mhm.
perhaps a different constraint, which is people will have expectation over how should be your behavior. And perhaps you are now changing your own constraints about your self constraint about how your behavior should be. So it becomes a constraint thing anyway. But I do understand now what you mean, that this is why I think that this is something that we discussed last time. Like, I do believe in the power of changing social norms, even though it's harder for us to even think how to manipulate that. And I know we don't have more time anymore to talk, but maybe in the future we can talk more about how we can change social norms about that. I think this is a
Yeah.
very fruitful uh, path, I think.
And it might be
I
useful to
would
think about a
also,
specific example too.
exactly. And I would also say that I do not see, I think sometimes creating social norm itself is a little bit of an attractor, as in some people will find it useful, other people will not. And people who will not find it to be useful will be people, again, the minority kinds of people. So I'll find that leveling the playing field along the lines of something like an UBI could be particularly helpful to first reduce the fake diversity that exists in the world. But anyway, we can talk much more about that, because I
Yeah.
do believe that this is a very fruitful path, the idea of thinking more about social norms. Okay, cool, man. We'll talk
All
to
right,
you.
man.